For nearly 20 years, Levi believed he understood the value of a building. At 49, he had built a quiet reputation across Utah by purchasing apartment buildings most people ignored. They were the properties with cracked sidewalks, aging roofs, outdated plumbing, and owners who had long since stopped trying to keep up with repairs. Other investors looked at those places and saw risk. Levi looked at them and saw opportunity. His approach was never flashy. He wasn't interested in tearing down neighborhoods to replace them with expensive luxury apartments. He preferred restoring what was already there, giving old buildings another chance while earning an honest return on his investment. Every purchase followed the same routine. He studied inspection reports, calculated renovation costs, negotiated a fair price, hired reliable contractors, and worked through a carefully planned schedule until the property became profitable again. Numbers made sense to him because they were dependable. Concrete budgets, predictable timelines, occupancy rates, maintenance expenses, rental income. Those figures never hid their intentions or surprised him without warning. People were different. People carried stories that couldn't be measured on spreadsheets. Still, Levi rarely allowed himself to become personally involved with the residents. Experience had taught him that maintaining professional distance made difficult business decisions easier. His responsibility was to provide safe housing, keep the property operating properly, and treat tenants fairly. Beyond that, he believed every resident deserved the privacy to live their own life. That philosophy had served him well for years, until the afternoon he purchased an aging 40-unit apartment building tucked into an older neighborhood of Ogden, Utah. The property itself didn't impress anyone. The boiler had become unreliable every winter. Several electrical systems no longer met city requirements. Water pipes complained loudly whenever someone turned on a faucet, and portions of the roof needed immediate attention before another snowy season arrived. Previous owners had postponed repairs for so long that nearly every part of the building required attention. Most buyers would have walked away. Levi signed the purchase agreement without hesitation. The relocation program had already been arranged before the sale was finalized. Every household received financial assistance to help them move into other apartments while the renovations took place. Most accepted the offer with gratitude, relieved to leave behind years of neglected maintenance. By the time Levi received the keys, the building had grown remarkably quiet. 39 apartments stood empty. Only one family remained. He expected arguments. He expected demands. He expected someone unwilling to cooperate with renovation plans. Instead, he found something he had never included in a property valuation. A woman whose quiet kindness had slowly become the invisible thread connecting an entire community. Before long, Levi would discover that replacing pipes, repairing roofs, and repainting walls was the simplest part of restoring an apartment building. Protecting the trust people had built inside those walls would prove far more difficult. And for the first time in his career, he would begin questioning whether the greatest investment he had ever made had nothing to do with real estate at all. Welcome to Hollow Creek Chronicles, a place where every quiet town has a hidden story. Every stranger has a past, and every choice leaves a lasting mark. If this is your first visit, we're happy you found us. If you've been here before, welcome back. Subscribe and join us as we uncover stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. Levi had never believed that success came from chasing the newest opportunities. At 49, he had built his livelihood by looking where everyone else refused to look. While larger investment firms competed for modern apartment complexes with polished entrances and waiting lists of prospective tenants, Levi drove through older neighborhoods, searching for buildings that still had honest potential beneath years of neglect. His philosophy had remained unchanged for nearly 2 decades. Every building deserved someone willing to see what it could become, instead of focusing only on what it had become. Friends often asked why he kept buying properties that required months of repairs when newer developments promised faster profits. His answer never changed. If the structure is still sound, he would say, it deserves another chance. That belief had earned him respect among contractors, electricians, plumbers, and inspectors throughout northern Utah. They knew Levi wasn't interested in cosmetic improvements designed only to impress buyers. He preferred replacing failing systems, repairing what had been ignored, and creating apartments where ordinary working families could live safely without paying luxury prices. It wasn't glamorous work. It rarely attracted attention, but it allowed Levi to sleep well each night. That reputation eventually led him to an aging 40-unit apartment building tucked into one of Ogden's older neighborhoods. The property had been constructed in the late 1960s, during a period when the surrounding streets bustled with mechanics heading to nearby repair shops, teachers walking home from neighborhood schools, postal workers finishing their routes, and families who expected to remain there for decades. Time had changed the neighborhood. Some businesses had closed. Others had adapted. New families arrived while older generations moved closer to children and grandchildren. The apartment building remained standing through every season of change, although the years had left unmistakable reminders. The boilers struggled each winter. Several electrical panels no longer satisfied current city requirements. Water pipes protested whenever multiple apartments used hot water at the same time. The roof leaked during certain storms, creating just enough uncertainty for owners to postpone permanent repairs one year after another. Nothing had failed all at once. Everything had simply grown older together. The previous owner had spent years promising himself he would eventually catch up on maintenance. He never did. After his passing, his children inherited the property. They reviewed contractor estimates, compared renovation costs against expected returns, and reached the same conclusion without much disagreement. Selling made more sense than rebuilding. Levi saw the listing before most investors even noticed it. Within days, he requested inspections. Within weeks, negotiations were complete. On the afternoon of closing, the representative at the title company slid the final documents across the conference table with a polite smile. "Congratulations," she said before pausing briefly. "I hope everything works out." Her voice carried genuine kindness rather than celebration. Levi smiled politely. "I appreciate that." After signing the final page, he accepted the keys, thanked everyone involved, and walked toward the parking lot, already thinking through renovation schedules, contractor availability, and inspection deadlines. Before ownership officially transferred, relocation assistance had been offered to every resident. Most accepted immediately. Some had waited years for major repairs and welcomed a fresh start elsewhere. Others found apartments closer to work or family. Several elderly residents moved in with relatives who had been encouraging them for months. The departures happened steadily until the building became unusually quiet. One apartment after another emptied. Mailboxes displayed forwarding notices. Curtains disappeared from windows. Parking spaces remained vacant long after sunset. When Levi conducted his first inspection as owner, silence followed him through nearly every hallway. 39 apartments stood empty. Only one still showed unmistakable signs of everyday life. A small bicycle rested beside the exterior railing. A pair of children's rain boots sat neatly outside one door despite clear skies. Fresh grocery bags appeared near the entrance late Tuesday afternoon. Someone had swept the shared walkway before sunrise, leaving tidy lines across the concrete that stood out against the dust gathering elsewhere. Those weren't details listed in inspection reports. They were quiet reminders that one family still called the building home. As Levi completed another walk through the property, movement near the dumpster caught his attention. A woman wearing clinic scrubs beneath a thick hoodie struggled to drag a heavy cardboard box across the parking area. Her hair was loosely tied back, and the tired determination on her face suggested she had already moved several similar boxes that morning. She stopped after noticing him. "You buying this place?" she asked. "I already did." She looked around the nearly empty property before offering a faint smile. "Well, congratulations." There wasn't resentment in her voice, only exhaustion. Levi nodded toward the box. "Need a hand?" She hesitated for only a second, It's heavier than it looks. They usually are. Together they carried it toward the dumpster. Inside lay broken picture frames, worn kitchen drawers, old lamps, school art projects, and dozens of ordinary possessions that had quietly reached the end of their usefulness. She brushed dust from her hands. I've been clearing things out for weeks. Getting ready to move? She looked back toward the apartment building before answering. I honestly don't know what comes next. Levi respected the silence that followed. He had learned long ago that people often revealed more when they weren't rushed into filling every quiet moment. As he headed back toward the entrance, another small moment caught his eye. An elderly resident stepped from a nearby apartment holding an empty coffee mug and walked directly into the woman's apartment without knocking. A little later he returned, carrying fresh coffee and a banana, smiling to himself. Not long afterward, a teenage girl stopped by after school and left carrying a container that looked like a packed lunch for the following day. A delivery driver arrived before evening and headed straight to the same apartment without asking where anyone lived. Levi glanced toward the woman. You seem to know everybody. She offered a modest shrug. They know me. It was such a simple answer. Yet as Levi continued his inspection, he found himself thinking less about renovation schedules and more about a question no property report had prepared him to ask. Why did an entire apartment building seem to place its trust in one quiet woman named Naomi? The following Monday, Levi arrived just after 7 in the morning with a notebook tucked beneath one arm and a paper cup of black coffee in the other. The parking lot looked almost abandoned, exactly as it had during his first visit. Empty spaces stretched across the cracked asphalt, interrupted only by his pickup truck and Naomi's aging sedan parked in its usual corner near apartment 18. The renovation schedule officially began that week. Electricians needed access to every vacant unit. Plumbers were preparing estimates for replacing aging supply lines. Roofing contractors planned to inspect damaged sections before winter settled across northern Utah. City inspectors would be visiting throughout the week to identify everything requiring updates before construction could begin. For Levi, it was the familiar beginning of another restoration project. By mid-morning, the building was busier than it had been in months. Contractors carried ladders through hallways. Clipboards passed from one inspector to another. Measurements were called across empty apartments. The sound of tape measures snapping back into place echoed through vacant rooms. Levi moved from floor to floor answering questions and confirming schedules, careful to keep everyone working efficiently. Yet, despite the activity surrounding him, something continued drawing his attention. Apartment 18. Every hour or so, someone knocked on Naomi's door. The visits were never dramatic. An older woman stopped by carrying 2 empty glass jars and left a few minutes later with homemade soup. A middle-aged man asked Naomi to help him understand paperwork from his insurance company before thanking her and heading home with a relieved expression. A young mother briefly handed Naomi a set of keys while she rushed to pick up her children from school. Nothing about those interactions looked unusual by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern Levi couldn't ignore. Nobody seemed embarrassed to ask for her help. More surprisingly, Naomi never acted inconvenienced. She simply listened, offered whatever assistance she could, and returned to whatever she had been doing moments earlier. Late that afternoon, Levi stood outside reviewing revised electrical plans when laughter drifted into the hallway. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was the easy laughter of people comfortable in one another's company. Curious, he glanced toward Naomi's apartment. Her front door stood slightly open. Inside, 4 neighbors sat around a small kitchen table that had clearly seen years of family dinners. A deck of playing cards rested in the center, while several mismatched coffee mugs surrounded it. Nobody seemed concerned about expensive furniture or perfectly decorated rooms. The conversation itself appeared to be the evening's entertainment. You cannot honestly believe raisins belong in oatmeal cookies, one elderly woman declared, pointing an accusing finger across the table. They absolutely do, another replied without hesitation. They make the cookies, Taste responsible." The room erupted with laughter. Naomi noticed Levi standing in the hallway and smiled. "You're just in time." "For what?" "Settling an argument." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm probably not qualified." "You've lived long enough to have an opinion." He stepped a little closer to the doorway without entering. "What exactly am I deciding?" Naomi folded her arms with playful seriousness. "Do raisins belong in oatmeal cookies?" Levi looked around the table. 4 pairs of eyes waited for his answer. He couldn't remember the last time strangers had looked at him with such sincere curiosity over something so ordinary. After pretending to think about it, he finally smiled. "I'll admit they're not my favorite." The table exploded with celebration. One gentleman gently tapped the tabletop with both hands. "I knew it!" Another neighbor laughed so hard she needed a tissue. Naomi shook her head. "You picked a side faster than I expected." I answered honestly. "That's how these debates usually end." Levi found himself smiling as he turned to leave. "Looks like I walked into serious business." "The most serious," Naomi replied. Before he reached the hallway, she picked up a paper plate from the kitchen counter. "Wait." He stopped. She held out a large oatmeal cookie. "Take one." "I didn't contribute much." "You settled the argument." "I thought I made things worse." "You made someone happy." He accepted the cookie with a quiet laugh. The first bite confirmed it wasn't particularly good. It was dry. The cinnamon overpowered almost everything else. The raisins certainly didn't improve it. Even so, he finished every bite before reaching the stairwell. Not because of the cookie, because someone had offered it without expecting anything in return. As the week continued, Levi noticed something else. Naomi rarely seemed to stop moving. Before sunrise, she left for the medical clinic where she worked. Each evening, she returned carrying groceries instead of stopping to rest. She checked on older residents before entering her own apartment. She helped one neighbor complete online paperwork using her laptop. She reset another resident's television remote after listening patiently while he insisted the batteries couldn't possibly be the problem. Twice she spent an hour helping 2 children with basic math homework at the kitchen table. Only after everyone else had gone home did she begin preparing dinner for herself and her father. Levi couldn't understand how she managed it every day. One evening, after contractors had finally packed their equipment and silence returned to the hallways, he found Naomi replacing burned-out light bulbs near the shared laundry room. "You've had a long day," he said. "So have you." She climbed down carefully from the small step stool. "Aren't maintenance requests my responsibility now?" She smiled. "They are." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because I noticed the bulbs were out." He looked at the new light shining across the hallway. "You spend a lot of time helping people." She shrugged, as though the observation hardly mattered. "Most people would do the same." "I'm not sure they would." Naomi didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gathered the old bulbs into a small box. Finally, she said quietly, "Sometimes people help however they can." Her words stayed with Levi long after he returned to the temporary office he had set up in the leasing room. That evening, before locking the file cabinet, he noticed several boxes containing decades of tenant records and maintenance reports left behind by previous management. Almost without thinking, he pulled the oldest box onto his desk. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he suddenly wanted to know whether Naomi had always been this important to the people who lived there, or whether something had happened over the years that quietly made her the person everyone turned to first. The leasing office had been converted into a temporary workspace while Levi prepared for the renovation project. A folding table held blueprints, inspection reports, permit applications, and a laptop that rarely stayed closed for long. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, each filled with records inherited from the previous owner. Most investors would have paid little attention to documents that old. Once a property changed hands, they usually focused on the future instead of the past. But Levi had learned that old files often explained present-day problems. He carried one of the boxes onto the table and removed a stack of maintenance logs arranged by year. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Leaking faucets, broken window latches, parking complaints, heating repairs, requests for replacement appliances. The entries reflected the predictable rhythm of apartment life. Then a familiar name appeared. If resident unavailable, ask Naomi. Levi paused. He turned another page. Mrs. Collins needs transportation to her doctor's appointment. Naomi has volunteered to take her. A few pages later, package delivered. Left with Naomi after resident requested she sign. Another. Resident locked out after midnight. Naomi confirmed spare key location and stayed until access was restored. He continued reading. Power outage. Naomi checked on elderly residents before maintenance arrived. Another page. Emergency water shut off. Naomi assisted with notifying occupied units. Another. Tenant confused by online rent portal. Naomi helped complete payment. Year after year. Different handwriting. Different property managers. The same name. Levi leaned back in his chair. Nobody had officially hired Naomi. There was no record of compensation, no management position, no volunteer title, nothing formal at all. Yet over the years, something remarkable had happened without meetings, contracts, or announcements. The residents had quietly chosen the same person whenever someone needed help. Not because anyone instructed them to, because experience had taught them she would answer. He closed the folder and looked through the office window toward apartment 18. For weeks, he had viewed that apartment as the only occupied unit delaying construction. Now it looked different. It wasn't delaying anything. It was holding together the last remaining thread of a community that had existed long before his arrival. That realization unsettled him more than he expected. His renovation schedule listed apartment 18 as another unit that would eventually need to be emptied. The paperwork didn't mention trust. It didn't account for relationships. It couldn't calculate what happened when one dependable person quietly became the center of everyday life for dozens of neighbors. No spreadsheet measured that. Late the following afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the Wasatch Mountains. Weather reports had predicted light snow later in the month, but Utah had a habit of following its own schedule. By sunset, thick flakes drifted across the parking lot. Within an hour, the snowfall intensified. Contractors packed their equipment earlier than planned. City inspectors postponed the remaining appointments. Several roads began reporting hazardous conditions. Levi decided to stay long enough to make certain temporary generators and emergency equipment were properly secured before heading home. He had almost finished checking the maintenance room when the lights flickered once, twice. Then the entire building fell into darkness. For a brief moment, only the wind could be heard pressing against aging windows. Levi reached for the flashlight stored beside the electrical panel. Before he switched it on, soft beams of light began appearing throughout the hallway. Flashlights, battery lanterns, small camping lamps. Doors opened one after another. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed. There wasn't even confusion. Residents simply stepped into the hallway as though they had practiced this routine before. Blankets were carried downstairs. Someone distributed extra batteries. Another resident rolled out a cart filled with bottled water. An older gentleman carefully checked on two neighbors before making his way toward the common laundry room. Levi followed the quiet movement through the building until he found Naomi standing near the entrance with a folded sheet of notebook paper in one hand. She wasn't giving orders. She was asking simple questions. "Has anyone checked on Mr. Hernandez?" "I have," one woman answered. "He's warm and already made tea." "Good." "What about Mrs. Collins?" "She's downstairs." Naomi smiled. "Perfect." Levi looked around the hallway. "You planned all this?" She looked at him with mild surprise. "We've been through winter outages before, so everyone already knew what to do." She nodded. "We talked about it after the last one." There was no pride in her voice. only quiet practicality. A few minutes later, residents gathered inside the shared laundry room where the walls held warmth better than the individual apartments. Someone plugged a portable kettle into an emergency battery pack. A teenager dealt cards across a folding table. Children laughed while teaching one another a simple game using coins instead of board pieces. An elderly resident admitted he had spent 2 years watching online guitar lessons but still couldn't play an entire song without making mistakes. The room filled with warm laughter. Levi accepted a paper cup of hot soup from someone whose name he hadn't yet learned. No one asked whether he belonged there. No one treated him like the new owner. For that evening, he was simply another person sharing the same roof. He sat quietly, watching conversations move naturally from one group to another. No expensive amenities. No modern clubhouse. No luxury finishes. Yet there was something inside that old building many newer properties never managed to create. People genuinely cared about one another. As the snow continued falling outside, Levi found himself looking around the room instead of studying renovation budgets for the first time since buying the property. The walls would eventually receive fresh paint. The plumbing would be replaced. The electrical system would be brought up to code. Those improvements mattered. But sitting among neighbors who instinctively looked after one another, another thought settled into his mind with unexpected clarity. Perhaps the most valuable thing he had purchased had never been the apartment building itself. Perhaps it was the trust that had quietly grown inside it, one ordinary act of kindness at a time. The snowstorm passed during the night. By sunrise, fresh snow rested across rooftops, parked cars, and the quiet sidewalks surrounding the apartment building. Maintenance crews cleared the main entrance before contractors began arriving again, their trucks leaving narrow tracks through the white blanket covering the parking lot. Levi stood near the leasing office window with a mug of coffee warming his hands. His renovation calendar lay open on the desk. Every task had been carefully organized before he ever purchased the property. Electrical upgrades, plumbing replacement, roof repairs, interior demolition, painting, flooring. The schedule reflected years of experience. Normally, he trusted it without hesitation. This morning he reached for his pen and quietly crossed out 3 dates. He moved them back 2 weeks. Then he adjusted several contractor appointments. It wasn't a dramatic delay, but it was enough to surprise even himself. Nothing about the building had changed overnight. The walls still needed repair. The pipes were still aging. The electrical system still required updating. Yet after sharing an evening with the remaining residents, Levi could no longer think about the project as though it existed separately from the people living inside it. For the first time in years, he wasn't asking how quickly renovations could begin. He was asking how they could happen without breaking something far more difficult to rebuild. That question stayed with him throughout the day. Instead of spending every hour reviewing construction estimates, he found himself paying closer attention to the people who still visited the building. Some had already moved into new apartments across town but continued returning. At first he assumed they had forgotten belongings. Soon he realized they had come back for someone. Late that morning, an older woman stopped near apartment 18, carrying a covered baking dish. Naomi answered before the second knock. "I made too much chicken pot pie again," the woman said with an embarrassed smile. Naomi laughed softly. "You've been making too much for at least 5 years." "I know. You should come inside for a minute." "I can't stay long." "You always say that." The older woman eventually remained nearly half an hour. When she finally came back outside, Levi happened to be checking measurements along the front walkway. She recognized him immediately. "You must be the new owner." "I am." She smiled warmly. "I wanted to thank you for waiting until after the storm, before starting the noisy work. It seemed like the right decision." It was. She looked back toward Naomi's apartment before speaking again. "That young woman has looked after more people in this building than she'll ever admit." Levi leaned against the railing. "How long have you known her?" "Long enough to remember when she first moved in. What was she like? The woman chuckled. Exactly like she is now. What do you mean? She noticed people. Levi waited. When my husband passed away several years ago, I stopped leaving my apartment unless I absolutely had to. She paused for a moment, looking beyond the parking lot as though revisiting memories she hadn't expected to share. Most people assumed I wanted privacy. And Naomi? Naomi knocked every Saturday morning. What did she say? I'm making too much coffee. You can either help me drink it or let me waste it. Levi smiled. That was her invitation. It worked. The woman laughed quietly. She never treated me like someone who needed rescuing. She simply acted as though my company mattered. After she left, Levi remained outside longer than necessary. It struck him that Naomi's kindness rarely involved grand gestures. She didn't organize public fundraisers. She didn't seek recognition. She simply paid attention to ordinary needs before they became larger problems. Throughout the week, similar conversations happened without Levi planning them. A former tenant stopped by to collect forwarded mail. Before leaving, he pointed toward apartment 18. When my truck broke down 2 winters ago, Naomi drove me to work for 4 mornings before I found another ride. Another resident returned to retrieve furniture from storage. I was terrified of computers, she admitted with a laugh. Naomi spent 3 evenings teaching me how to use video calls so I could see my grandson after he joined the Navy. A delivery driver recognized Levi while dropping off supplies. Apartment 18? Levi nodded. The driver smiled. I've been delivering here for years. She always asked whether I'd eaten lunch. Every delivery? Every single one. None of the stories sounded extraordinary on their own. That was precisely what made them remarkable. Naomi hadn't changed lives through dramatic moments. She had earned trust through hundreds of small decisions that most people would never notice. Curiously, whenever someone praised her, Naomi redirected the conversation almost immediately. If a neighbor thanked her, she asked about their family. If someone complimented her generosity, she laughed and changed the subject. If another resident recalled something she had done years earlier, she insisted anyone else would have done the same. Levi began realizing that humility wasn't something Naomi practiced. It was simply part of who she was. Late Friday afternoon, he stood alone in the leasing office reviewing updated renovation budgets. The numbers still mattered. They always would. But for the first time in his career, another question carried equal weight. Perhaps success wasn't measured only by what a building earned after renovations. Perhaps it should also be measured by whether the people inside felt seen, valued, and cared for long after the work was finished. Levi closed the folder without making another calculation. There were still many things he didn't understand about Naomi, but each passing day convinced him that restoring this property required learning far more than construction. It required understanding the quiet community that had already been built long before he arrived. By the second week after the snowstorm, Levi found fewer reasons to rush back to his office between inspections. Most mornings still began the same way. He met contractors before sunrise, answered questions about permits, reviewed material deliveries, and walked through vacant apartments making notes about repairs that had been overlooked during earlier inspections. Yet once those responsibilities were finished, he noticed his steps naturally slowing whenever he reached the hallway leading to apartment 18. Not because he intended to interrupt Naomi. Quite the opposite. He had become interested in understanding the ordinary rhythm of her days. It wasn't difficult to see why the residents depended on her. What surprised him was how much responsibility she carried, without ever speaking about it. One morning, just before 6, Levi arrived early to meet a plumbing crew. The winter air stung his face as he crossed the parking lot. Naomi was already leaving for work. She carried a travel mug in one hand and a small, insulated lunch bag in the other. She locked her apartment quietly, careful not to disturb anyone nearby. As she turned toward her car, she noticed Levi. "You start early," she said. "So do you." She smiled. "Medical clinics don't wait for people to wake up." "I suppose They don't? She gave a small wave before driving away. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Still, Levi found himself wondering what her workdays looked like before she returned each evening to care for everyone else. That answer came gradually, never through Naomi herself, always through observation. Every afternoon, almost without exception, her sedan pulled into the same parking space shortly after 5. She never went straight inside. Groceries usually occupied the back seat. She carried them upstairs in 2 or 3 trips. Then, before closing her own door, she paused at neighboring apartments. Sometimes she knocked. Sometimes she simply listened. If she heard conversation inside, she continued home. If everything remained quiet, she gently checked to make sure each resident was all right. No one seemed surprised by the routine. It had clearly become part of daily life long before Levi arrived. A few evenings later, Levi was reviewing measurements near the mailboxes when Naomi emerged carrying a covered container. "Be right back," she said with an apologetic smile. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Mr. Hernandez isn't feeling well today." She disappeared down the hallway. 10 minutes later she returned, carrying the now empty container. "You cooked dinner for him? He wasn't hungry enough to cook. And you knew that? I checked on him after work." She spoke as though the explanation required no further discussion. Levi looked at the container in her hands. "You've had a full day yourself." "So has he." Again she said nothing that invited praise. She simply unlocked her apartment and stepped inside. Several days later, Levi happened to arrive while Naomi was helping her father into the courtyard for a little fresh air. The older man moved carefully, leaning on a cane while Naomi matched every step without making him feel rushed. She didn't hover over him. She simply remained close enough that he could rely on her if he needed to. Her father noticed Levi first. "You must be the fellow fixing this old place." Levi smiled. "I'm trying." The older man chuckled. "Good." Naomi looked slightly embarrassed. "Dad." "What?" "You're putting him on the spot." "I'm thanking him." Levi laughed softly. "I'll take that as encouragement." Her father settled onto a nearby bench while Naomi adjusted the blanket across his knees. The movement was practiced, gentle, unhurried. Levi recognized it immediately. She had done this many times before. They spoke only a few minutes before Levi excused himself to meet an electrician. As he walked away, he glanced back once. Naomi was listening while her father spoke, smiling at something he had said. There was no impatience in her expression, only complete attention. That evening, Levi stayed later than usual to review updated structural reports. Most contractors had already left. The hallways had grown quiet. As he locked the temporary office, he noticed a faint light beneath Naomi's apartment door. The hour was approaching 10. He assumed she was finally relaxing after another long day. Instead, when he passed by, the door stood slightly open. Naomi sat beside the kitchen table, surrounded by unopened bills, medical paperwork, and a notebook filled with handwritten reminders. She rubbed one hand across her forehead before reaching for a calculator. For the first time since meeting her, Levi saw something she usually kept hidden. She was exhausted, not dramatically, not the kind of exhaustion that demanded sympathy. It was the steady weariness carried by someone who spent every day solving other people's problems before facing her own. She sensed movement in the hallway and looked up. "Oh." She quickly gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I was just leaving." She smiled, though the tiredness around her eyes remained. "Long day?" He asked the question gently. She considered it for a moment before answering. "They've all been long lately. You should get some rest." "I will." Instead of pretending everything was easy, she simply offered an honest answer. "I'm just trying to stay caught up." Levi nodded. "I understand." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Naomi closed the notebook. "Good night, Levi." "Good night, Naomi." As he walked toward the parking lot, Levi realized something had quietly changed between them. When they first met, they had been a property owner and a tenant whose future remained uncertain. Now there was something else growing between them. Not romance, not obligation. Respect. It had formed naturally through countless ordinary moments. The more Levi learned about Naomi's daily life, the more he admired the quiet strength required to carry so much responsibility without expecting recognition. And for the first time in many years, he found himself wanting to make someone's burden a little lighter, not because it was good business, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a welcome break from the snow that had settled over Ogden earlier in the week. For the first time since purchasing the building, Levi intentionally left his laptop in the temporary office. The renovation schedules could wait until Monday. There were still contractors to coordinate and permits to finalize, but none of those tasks felt as urgent as they had only a few weeks earlier. Instead, he spent the morning walking through the building without a clipboard in his hand. He noticed things he would once have overlooked. The worn handrail polished smooth after decades of use. The bulletin board, where old community notices still hung beside faded birthday cards and handwritten reminders. The familiar scent of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway near apartment 18. Life still existed inside the aging building. It simply looked different now that only one family remained. As he reached the second-floor landing, Naomi stepped out carrying a small paper bag. She looked surprised to find him there. "No inspections today?" He smiled. "I decided the building deserved one quiet morning." She laughed softly. "I don't think buildings mind either way. What about you?" "I'm heading to the neighborhood grocery store." She lifted the paper bag slightly. "I promised Mrs. Collins I'd pick up a few things." Levi glanced toward the parking lot. "I was about to head into town myself." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "Need groceries?" "Not really. So why are you going?" He smiled. "I guess I don't have a very good reason." She shook her head with an amused expression. "You don't have to invent errands." "I'm not." "No? I was actually wondering if you'd mind some company." Naomi studied him for a second before nodding. "As long as you don't mind stopping more than once, I'll survive." Their first stop wasn't the grocery store. It was a neighborhood pharmacy. Naomi collected a prescription for her father before carefully checking the instructions printed on the label. Next came a bakery, where the owner greeted her by name. "You finally taking a day off?" he asked. She laughed. "I'm trying." He handed her a small paper sack. "Extra dinner rolls." "I only ordered 6. "I know." She looked ready to object. The baker smiled. "Take them." "Thank you." As they walked back toward the truck, Levi noticed something. "You know everyone." Naomi smiled without looking up. "No, they know you." "I've lived here a long time, long enough for the baker to ignore your order and give you more food than you paid for." She laughed again. "He's been doing that ever since my father complimented his sourdough." Their final stop was the grocery store. Naomi moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency. She compared prices before placing anything in the cart. She checked discount labels. She calculated totals without needing a calculator. When they reached the checkout line, Levi noticed her quietly removing 2 items from the cart. "You forgot those?" "No." "Changed your mind?" "They can wait until next week." Without saying anything, Levi picked up the 2 items, a container of fresh fruit and a package of coffee, and placed them back on the conveyor belt. Naomi looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know. I'll buy them later." "I believe you." The cashier finished scanning the groceries. Before Naomi could object again, Levi paid for the entire order. Outside, she stopped beside the truck. "I appreciate the gesture." He leaned against the tailgate. "It wasn't a gesture." "It wasn't?" "No." "What was it?" Levi thought carefully before answering. "I've watched you spend weeks making life easier for everyone around you." She looked down at the grocery bags. I don't keep score. I know. Then why did you? Because sometimes the people who take care of everyone else need someone willing to notice them. Naomi remained quiet for several moments. Finally, she smiled. My father always says accepting help can be harder than offering it. He sounds wise. He usually is. The drive back to the apartment building passed comfortably. Neither of them felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. When they arrived, Levi carried several grocery bags upstairs while Naomi unlocked the apartment. As he stepped inside for the first time, nothing about the home surprised him. It was modest. The furniture had clearly been used for many years. Family photographs filled one wall. Children's artwork from years earlier had been carefully saved in simple frames. Everything reflected care rather than wealth. Naomi's father looked up from his chair. You talked him into carrying the heavy bags? Naomi smiled. I didn't have to. Her father looked toward Levi. That's good. I figured I could manage. The older man nodded with approval. People remember small kindnesses longer than big speeches. Levi placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. I think I'm beginning to understand that. A little later, after saying goodbye, Levi stepped back into the hallway. Naomi followed him to the doorway. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you bought this building, she hesitated before continuing. Why didn't you become like some of the other owners? What do you mean? They rarely learned anyone's name. Levi rested one hand against the railing outside her apartment. My father worked maintenance at an apartment complex when I was growing up. Naomi listened quietly. He used to tell me that buildings don't take care of people. What does? The people willing to look after one another inside them. She smiled thoughtfully. He sounds a lot like my father. He probably would have liked him. A comfortable silence settled between them before Levi finally asked the question that had stayed with him since the day they first met beside the dumpster. Naomi. Yes? Almost everyone accepted the relocation assistance. They did. You could have left too. I could have. So why didn't you? She looked down the quiet hallway before answering. When people ask where home is, they usually expect an address. She gently rested one hand against the apartment door. For me, home has never been these walls. She glanced toward the stairwell where neighbors had gathered during the recent power outage. It's the people. Levi followed her gaze. She continued softly. My father has lived here for years. Our neighbors became our extended family long before you bought this building. We celebrated birthdays together. We brought each other meals after surgeries. We watched each other's children grow up. We sat together after funerals because no one should grieve alone. She met Levi's eyes again. I stayed because leaving before everyone knew what came next didn't feel right. Those words settled heavily in Levi's thoughts. As he walked slowly toward the parking lot, the renovation timeline waiting inside his office no longer felt complete. The building still needed restoration. There was no question about that. But now he understood something his original plans had completely overlooked. This was no longer just another investment. It had quietly become a responsibility. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures just cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost along the apartment building's railings. Levi unlocked the temporary leasing office before sunrise, switched on the lights, and spread the updated renovation plans across the folding table. Only a month earlier he would have approved every proposal exactly as they had been submitted. Today he read each page differently. The contractors arrived one after another. By 8 o'clock, the room was filled with blueprints, measurements, permit documents, and conversations about schedules. We'll begin demolition on the second floor first, the general contractor said, pointing to the layout. That lets every trade move through the building without doubling back. Levi studied the drawing. And apartment 18? We'll empty it first. The answer came so naturally that no one else in the room noticed it. Levi looked up. Not first. The contractor blinked. It slows everything down If we leave that unit until the end, I understand. We've always started with occupied units. I know. The contractor waited. Levi folded his hands across the table. We'll work around apartment 18. Silence settled over the room. One electrician glanced toward the others before speaking. That's going to make scheduling more complicated. It will. Is there a reason? Levi nodded. There is. He didn't elaborate. Not because he wanted to keep secrets, but because he wasn't sure the explanation could fit inside a construction meeting. How could he explain that a single apartment represented far more than one occupied space? How could he reduce trust, friendship, and years of quiet generosity into language suitable for project management? He simply couldn't. The meeting continued. Instead of approving the original demolition sequence, Levi reorganized the schedule. Vacant apartments would be completed first. Shared hallways would remain accessible whenever possible. Utility shutdowns would be shorter and planned around the needs of the remaining residents. The adjustments required more coordination. They also required patience. When the meeting ended, the contractor remained behind. You've changed your approach. Levi smiled slightly. I suppose I have. I've worked with you a long time. I know. You usually make decisions based on efficiency. I still do. The contractor looked unconvinced. This feels different. Levi glanced through the office window toward the courtyard. It is. He offered nothing more. Later that morning, the first work crews began replacing damaged plumbing inside several vacant apartments. The sounds of drills and hammers echoed briefly through the hallways before settling into a steady rhythm. Levi walked from floor to floor checking progress. Every worker knew exactly what needed to be done. Still, he found himself paying as much attention to the residents as he did the construction. Near the mailboxes, an elderly woman who had already moved into another apartment building stopped by to collect a forwarding package. She smiled the moment she recognized Levi. They've finally started. They have. She looked toward the sound of distant tools. I was worried. Worried about what? That this place would lose what made it special. Levi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, what made it special? She looked around the hallway with gentle affection. It never felt like strangers lived here. Before Levi could respond, she added, that wasn't because of the building. He smiled. I've started figuring that out. She nodded knowingly before continuing on her way. The conversation stayed with him long after she left. By lunchtime, several contractors gathered outside beside their trucks. Levi joined them for coffee. One of the younger workers glanced toward apartment 18. Who's still living there? A woman named Naomi. The nurse? She works at a clinic. The man nodded. I met her this morning. You did? I accidentally tracked mud into the hallway. He looked embarrassed. Before I could grab a mop, she was already cleaning it. Levi smiled. That sounds like Naomi. I offered to do it myself. What did she say? The young contractor laughed. You're already behind schedule. I'll take care of this one. Another worker shook his head. She brought our crew hot coffee before daylight. I thought someone ordered it. No, she just showed up with a cardboard tray and wished everyone a safe day. The conversation drifted toward other topics, but Levi noticed something important. Naomi treated everyone the same. Neighbors, delivery drivers, construction crews, complete strangers. She never adjusted her kindness, depending on who someone was. That afternoon, Levi walked through the second-floor hallway, carrying updated inspection notes. The sound of soft humming reached him before he reached apartment 18. Naomi's father sat beside the window, slowly polishing an old wooden picture frame, while Naomi folded freshly washed laundry nearby. Neither of them noticed Levi immediately. The apartment door stood partly open to let fresh air inside. Her father held up the frame. You remember this one? Naomi smiled. Of course. The first Christmas after we moved here. She laughed quietly. I thought that tree was enormous. It barely reached the ceiling. I was a lot shorter then. You certainly were. The warmth between them felt effortless. Nothing about the conversation seemed remarkable. It was simply family sharing an ordinary afternoon. Levi quietly continued walking without interrupting. As he reached the stairwell, he slowed for a moment. The renovation project was moving forward exactly as planned. Workers were repairing walls, replacing pipes, updating wiring, improving a building that desperately needed attention. Yet the more time he spent there, the more he understood something his blueprints had never shown him. A home wasn't created the day construction ended. It was built slowly, through years of shared meals, familiar voices, dependable neighbors, and ordinary moments that people rarely recognized while they were happening. Levi had purchased an apartment building. Only now was he beginning to understand the community that called it home. As the days passed, the rhythm of the building began to change. Construction crews arrived before sunrise and left before dusk, their work gradually transforming vacant apartments into clean, modern spaces. Fresh drywall replaced cracked walls. New plumbing disappeared neatly behind freshly installed fixtures. Updated wiring brought the aging building safely into the present without changing its familiar character. The progress was visible. What wasn't as visible was the effort Levi made to keep everyday life as undisturbed as possible. Whenever contractors needed to shut off water, he insisted they give Naomi advance notice so she could help the remaining residents prepare. When loud work became unavoidable, he scheduled it during hours when most neighbors were already away from the building. It required extra planning. No one complained. One afternoon, while reviewing the installation of new electrical panels, Levi noticed Naomi returning from work carrying 2 reusable grocery bags. She looked more tired than usual. Even from across the parking lot, he could see the weight of the day resting on her shoulders. She walked slowly toward the entrance, before stopping to greet an elderly resident sitting outside in the winter sunshine. The conversation lasted only a minute. Whatever the neighbor had asked, Naomi answered with the same patient smile Levi had come to recognize. Only afterward did she continue toward her apartment. She never hurried past people, not once. Levi waited until she reached the entrance. Long day? She adjusted one of the grocery bags. The clinic was busy. You look exhausted. She smiled politely. I've looked worse. I'm not sure that's very reassuring. She laughed softly. It wasn't meant to be. He reached for one of the bags. I've got this. You don't have to. I know. For a moment she hesitated, then handed him the heavier bag. Thank you. Together they climbed the stairs at an easy pace. Halfway to the second floor, Naomi paused to catch her breath. It lasted only a second. She smiled as though nothing had happened. Levi noticed anyway. You all right? I'm fine. You stopped. I've been on my feet since before sunrise. She answered honestly, without complaint. I'll feel better after dinner. When they reached apartment 18, Naomi unlocked the door. Her father looked up from his chair. You brought help. I ran into Levi downstairs. Her father smiled warmly. Good timing. Levi carried the groceries into the kitchen. As Naomi unpacked them, her father studied her for a moment. You skipped lunch again. She looked over her shoulder. I had a yogurt. A yogurt isn't lunch. It was today. Her father shook his head gently. You always think everyone else's schedule matters more than your own. Naomi smiled, clearly familiar with the conversation. I'll eat now. You'd better. Levi quietly stepped toward the doorway. I should let you two enjoy dinner. Naomi walked him outside. I'm sorry. For what? My father worries. I can see why. She looked down the hallway before speaking. He used to remind me to slow down when I was younger. And now? He still reminds me. But you don't. A thoughtful smile crossed her face. I try. You don't sound convinced. She rested one shoulder against the wall. When you're responsible for people, it's easy to believe they'll be fine if you wait just a little longer before taking care of yourself. Levi nodded slowly. And sometimes they are. And sometimes they aren't. She looked toward the courtyard through the nearby window. I know I can't solve everyone's problems, but I don't like walking away when I know someone needs help. Her words weren't dramatic. She wasn't trying to sound noble. She was simply explaining how she viewed the world. Levi thought about everything he had witnessed since buying the building. The coffee she quietly prepared. The homework she helped children finish. The groceries she carried for neighbors. The prescriptions she collected. The meals she delivered. The conversations she never seemed too busy to have. Each act by itself appeared small. Together, they explained why every resident trusted her. Later that evening, Levi finished reviewing contractor invoices before locking the leasing office. As he stepped outside, he noticed movement in the courtyard. Naomi sat alone on one of the wooden benches. For the first time since meeting her, she wasn't helping anyone. She simply sat in silence, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, while the cold evening air settled over the building. Levi considered walking back to his truck. Instead, he crossed the courtyard. Mind if I sit? She looked up and smiled. Not at all. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. I used to think this courtyard was enormous. When? When I first moved here. How old were you? She smiled at the memory. Younger than I realized. Levi chuckled. I know that feeling. They watched a few snowflakes drift from the branches overhead. You've changed the atmosphere around here, Naomi said. I've replaced a few pipes. She shook her head. I don't mean the building. He looked at her. Most owners stayed inside their office unless something was broken. I've noticed. You ask people how they're doing. I try. You remember what they tell you. Levi smiled. I've had good teachers. Naomi understood what he meant. She looked toward the apartments lining the courtyard. My father always says people don't remember every conversation. What do they remember? Whether they felt important while they were having it? Levi let those words settle between them. For years he had measured successful projects by completed renovations, occupied apartments, and balanced financial reports. Those things still mattered. But sitting beside Naomi beneath the quiet winter sky, he realized another measure of success had slowly found its way into his thinking. Respect wasn't earned through ownership. It was earned by consistently showing people they mattered. As they rose from the bench and walked back toward the entrance, neither of them realized how naturally they had begun matching each other's pace. Neither walked ahead. Neither hurried the other. Without either of them noticing, mutual respect had quietly grown into genuine friendship. One conversation, one shared moment, and one simple act of kindness at a time. The following morning, Levi arrived earlier than usual. The eastern sky had only begun to brighten, and the apartment building stood quietly beneath the pale light of dawn. Frost clung to the railings, while the windows reflected the first hints of sunrise spreading across the Wasatch Mountains. He unlocked the leasing office, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat in front of the renovation schedule. For several minutes, he simply looked at it. The timeline had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Every adjustment he had made over the previous weeks served the people still connected to the building, but each change also added cost. Extra labor, longer equipment rentals, revised contractor schedules. None of it threatened the project. Still, every delay required an explanation. His phone rang just after 8. It was one of his longtime business associates. How's Ogden coming along? It's moving. I looked over the revised construction schedule. Levi leaned back in his chair. I figured you had. A brief silence followed. You pushed everything back. I adjusted the sequence. That adjustment costs money. I'm aware. You've never managed projects this way before. Levi glanced toward the window overlooking the courtyard. No. So what's different? He watched Naomi leave for work, waving to an elderly neighbor before getting into her car. Finally, he answered, I understand the property better now. His associate laughed softly. I thought you understood it before you bought it. I understood the building. And now? I'm learning about the people. The conversation ended respectfully, though Levi knew his explanation hadn't made much business sense. Ordinarily, he might have agreed. Today, he couldn't. Later that afternoon, another former resident stopped by after receiving permission to collect a few belongings left in storage. Levi helped carry several boxes to the parking lot. Before leaving, the man looked back at the building. My daughter took her first steps in that hallway. He smiled to himself. Apartment 22. Levi followed his gaze. We lived there almost 11 years. That's a long time. He'd never felt temporary. The man rested one hand on the roof of his truck. You know why? Levi shook his head. Because people looked out for one another. He nodded toward apartment 18. Naomi checked on my wife every afternoon after our daughter was born. Levi listened quietly. I worked double shifts back then. The man smiled with quiet gratitude. My wife used to say she never felt alone because Naomi always knocked on the door at the right time. He climbed into his truck. Take care of this place. Levi answered without hesitation. I intend to. As the truck disappeared down the street, Levi remained standing in the parking lot. Another ordinary story. Another quiet reminder that Naomi had become part of moments she never spoke about herself. That evening, construction ended a little earlier than expected. The workers left just before sunset, leaving the building peaceful once again. Levi carried a folder upstairs, intending to leave updated notices outside apartment 18. Before he reached the door, Naomi stepped into the hallway, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. Perfect timing, she said. I was looking for you. I've got tomorrow's construction schedule. She smiled. I figured you would. He handed her the notices. They're shutting off the water for about 45 minutes after lunch. I'll let everyone know. Levi hesitated. You always say that. She looked at him curiously. Say what? I'll let everyone know, she laughed. Someone has to. You've been doing that for years. I suppose I have. He leaned lightly against the railing. Can I ask you something? You usually do. He smiled. Fair enough. She waited. When all those families moved away, was it difficult? Naomi looked down at the folded towels resting inside the basket. Very. You stayed cheerful. I tried. Were you? She considered the question carefully. No, it was the first time Levi had heard uncertainty in her voice. I smiled, because everyone else was already carrying enough. She looked toward the now empty apartments lining the hallway. Some families had lived here longer than I had. She paused. I helped pack boxes. I remember seeing some of that. I watched children say goodbye to friends. Her voice softened. I watched older neighbors leave apartments they thought they'd spend the rest of their lives in. Levi remained silent. She wasn't finished. I kept telling everyone things would work out. He nodded. Did you believe it? Another quiet pause. I wanted to. The honesty in those 3 words carried more weight than any speech could have. Levi realized Naomi hadn't simply remained behind to protect a building. She had stayed because someone needed to stand beside people while their lives were changing. Not because she had all the answers. Because she believed no one should face uncertainty alone. He looked down the hallway, where fresh paint now covered several repaired walls. The renovations were improving the property exactly as planned. Yet something about the original plan no longer felt complete. The goal had once been to restore an aging apartment building. Now that purpose seemed far too small. He wanted the families who eventually returned to feel what previous residents had experienced for years. He wanted neighbors who knew one another, children who felt safe playing outside together, older residents who never worried about facing difficult days without someone checking on them. He wanted the building to remain a place where people belonged, not because of modern finishes or updated appliances, because the community itself mattered. Naomi adjusted the basket in her arms. "You've been thinking a lot lately." "I have." "About construction?" He smiled. "Not as much as you'd expect." She laughed quietly. "That's probably a good thing." Levi looked once more along the hallway. When he first walked through those corridors, he had seen 40 apartments waiting to be renovated. Now he saw something entirely different. He saw years of shared birthdays, meals delivered after long days, children growing into adults, neighbors carrying one another through celebrations and grief. He finally understood why Naomi had chosen to stay. This building had never simply given people a place to live. It had given them people they could count on. As Levi made his way downstairs, one decision settled firmly in his mind. The project would continue. The renovations would move forward. But every choice from that day on would begin with one question before any budget, schedule, or construction drawing. Will this strengthen the community that already exists here, or weaken it? For Levi, the answer to that question had quietly become more important than any figure written on a balance sheet. The first signs of pressure arrived quietly. Levi had expected questions once the renovation schedule changed. Construction projects rarely moved without someone watching the calendar, comparing expenses against projected returns, and asking why work wasn't progressing exactly as planned. For years, those conversations had never bothered him. This time, they felt different. 3 weeks after revising the construction timeline, he drove across Ogden to attend a scheduled meeting with the financial partners who had helped fund portions of the purchase. They weren't involved in managing the property from day to day, but they monitored progress carefully. Delays affected budgets, and budgets affected everyone connected to the investment. The conference room overlooked a busy commercial district where traffic moved steadily through the afternoon. A stack of reports waited neatly at Levi's seat. One of the partners opened the meeting without wasting time. "We've reviewed your latest construction updates." Levi nodded. "I assumed you had. The project is moving slower than originally projected." "It is." Another partner slid a spreadsheet across the table. "Labor costs have increased." "I know. Equipment rentals have been extended." "They have." A brief silence settled over the room. Finally, someone asked the question Levi had expected. "Why?" He folded his hands together before answering. "Because I changed the order of the renovation." "We noticed." The original schedule no longer made sense. One of the partners leaned forward. From a financial standpoint, it made perfect sense. Levi remained calm. "From a construction standpoint, yes." "And now?" "I've learned there are other things worth protecting." The room grew quiet. Another partner adjusted his glasses. "We're talking about an apartment building." "We are." "Our responsibility is making sure it becomes profitable." "It will." "Then why complicate the process?" Levi looked through the conference room window for a moment before speaking. "Because a successful building isn't measured only by rental income." The response earned puzzled expressions. He continued, "If the renovations destroy the relationships that made people want to live there in the first place, we've improved the property without improving the community." One partner shook his head. "Communities don't appear on financial statements." "No, they don't increase market value." "They can." "Not on paper." Levi smiled politely. "Some of the most valuable things never do." The meeting ended professionally. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Yet Levi understood the concern. The numbers supported their position. Longer projects cost more money. Additional coordination reduced efficiency. From a purely financial perspective, they weren't wrong. As he drove back toward the apartment building, their questions stayed with him. For years he had probably asked similar questions himself. What had changed? The answer came almost immediately. He had changed. When he returned that afternoon, construction crews were replacing damaged windows in several vacant apartments. The work moved steadily, despite the colder weather. Levi greeted the crew before walking toward the leasing office. Near the entrance, he found Naomi helping an elderly resident organize several storage boxes that had recently been returned after temporary relocation. She looked up as he approached. "Everything all right?" He smiled. "Just a long meeting." "The kind with too many spreadsheets?" He laughed. "How did you guess?" "You have your thinking face." "My what?" "The one where you're answering questions even after the conversation is over." He hadn't realized she noticed things like that. "You aren't wrong." Naomi closed one of the storage boxes. "Tough day?" "Not the toughest." She waited. Levi appreciated that about her. She never rushed people into talking. "They think I'm making the project more expensive." "Are you?" "A little." She nodded thoughtfully. "And do you believe you're making it better?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched an electrician greet one of the returning residents by name before carrying equipment upstairs. Finally, he said, "Yes." "Then that's probably your answer." "It isn't that simple." "No." She smiled gently. "It rarely is." Her father opened the apartment door just then. "You two planning to solve the world's problems out here?" Naomi laughed. "We're only working on one building." "That's plenty." The older man looked toward Levi. "My father built furniture." Levi listened. "He used to tell me that anyone could make a chair quickly." He paused just long enough to gather the memory. "But if you wanted someone to sit in it for 20 years, you couldn't rush the work." Levi smiled. "He sounds like a wise man." "He made good chairs." Everyone laughed softly. Later that evening, after construction crews had gone home, Levi walked alone through the nearly completed first-floor apartments. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New lighting filled rooms that had once felt dim. Modern fixtures replaced worn-out plumbing. Objectively, the project was becoming everything he had planned. Yet he noticed something else. Whenever he imagined future residents moving into those apartments, he no longer pictured occupancy reports or monthly income. He pictured neighbors borrowing sugar from one another, children laughing in the courtyard, someone checking on an elderly resident after noticing lights hadn't come on that evening. He pictured a community, standing alone in one of the finished apartments. Levi quietly realized that he had already made his decision long before the meeting downtown. He could complete the project faster. He could reduce costs. He could satisfy every financial expectation placed before him. Or he could build something that people would still be proud to call home many years later. For the first time in his career, those two goals no longer felt identical. Levi switched off the apartment lights and locked the door behind him. Some investments earned money. Others quietly changed the person making them. He now understood the difference. The morning after the meeting with his financial partners, Levi arrived at the apartment building carrying a notebook instead of a folder full of cost projections. For the first time since purchasing the property, he wasn't thinking about construction schedules. He was thinking about what would happen after the renovations were complete. A building could be beautifully restored. That didn't automatically mean the people who once called it home could afford to return. The thought stayed with him as he walked through the courtyard. Fresh concrete had replaced cracked sections of the walkway. New landscaping had been marked out with small wooden stakes, though nothing had been planted yet. Workers continued repairing vacant apartments floor by floor, and every improvement brought the project closer to completion. Yet one question refused to leave him. Who would live here when the work was finished? Inside the leasing office, Levi spread several pages across his desk. Projected rental rates, operating expenses, property taxes, insurance estimates. Everything suggested the same conclusion. Charging the highest possible rent would recover the investment more quickly. It was the obvious financial decision. But as he looked through the numbers, faces kept replacing figures. The elderly woman who had talked about never feeling alone. The young father whose daughter had taken her first steps in apartment 22. The neighbors who had gathered during the snowstorm without waiting to be asked. The building had never simply housed people. It had connected them. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Naomi stood in the doorway. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." She stepped inside, carrying a small container. "My father insisted I bring you this." Levi accepted it. "What is it?" "Vegetable soup." "I thought I was buying groceries for you." "You were. So why am I getting lunch?" She smiled. "My father says kindness has a habit of traveling back." Levi laughed. "That sounds like something he'd say. He has dozens of sayings. I'm beginning to notice." Naomi looked at the papers covering his desk. "You've been working on this since early morning?" "I've been trying." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm trying to solve a problem." She pulled out the chair across from him. "May I?" "Of course." She sat quietly, waiting. Again, she never pressured anyone to explain more than they wanted to. Levi appreciated that. "When the renovations are finished," he said, "the easiest decision is raising rents enough to recover the investment as quickly as possible. And the harder decision? Finding a way for people who built this community to come back." Naomi looked down at the financial reports. "I'm guessing the numbers don't make that easy." "They don't." She remained thoughtful for a moment before speaking. "My father used to repair old radios." "I didn't know that." "He never threw away a radio, if he believed it could still work." Levi listened. People asked why he spent so much time fixing something inexpensive. What did he tell them? He'd say, "Because replacing something is easier than restoring it." She smiled gently. "I think communities are like that." Levi leaned back in his chair. "You think it's worth the extra effort?" "I think some things deserve patience." The words settled over the room. They weren't advice. They weren't an attempt to influence his decision. They simply reflected the way Naomi had always lived. After she left, Levi opened a fresh page in his notebook. Instead of calculating only profit, he began writing possibilities. Reserve a percentage of renovated apartments for former residents. Offer returning tenants the first opportunity to lease. Complete renovations in phases so families could move back as apartments became available. Work with local organizations to identify temporary housing during construction when necessary. None of the ideas eliminated financial pressure, but together, they created something he hadn't seen before. A path that respected both the investment and the people. That afternoon, Levi contacted the property management company overseeing future leasing. "I want to discuss the return process. For new applicants? For former residents?" There was a brief pause. "They've already relocated." "I know." "You want to invite them back?" "If they choose to return." The manager sounded surprised. "That isn't common." "Neither is this building." By late afternoon, several phone calls had been made. Contact information was updated. Letters began taking shape. Nothing had been finalized yet, but the first steps had been taken. As Levi walked through the courtyard before heading home, he noticed Naomi sitting beside her father on the bench near the entrance. They were watching workers load equipment into their trucks for the evening. Naomi smiled when she saw him. "Long day?" "A productive one." Her father looked at him. "You've made a decision." Levi smiled. "How did you know?" "You have a different expression." Naomi laughed. "He notices everything." Her father shrugged. "I've had practice." Levi sat on the opposite bench. "I think I've found a way to give former residents the first chance to return once apartments are finished." Naomi looked at him, genuinely surprised. They'd have that opportunity if they wanted. For the first time since they had met, Levi saw Naomi momentarily struggle to find words. She looked toward the quiet building before speaking. They'll be happy. I hope so. No. She shook her head with quiet certainty. They will. Her father smiled without saying anything. The three of them sat together as the last construction truck pulled away and the evening settled over the courtyard. The building still echoed with the sounds of renovation during the day. There was still work ahead. Budgets still needed careful attention. Difficult conversations still waited. But for the first time since Levi had purchased the property, the future no longer felt like something happening to the community. It felt like something they were beginning to build together. Over the next several days, the apartment building entered its busiest stage of renovation. Workers moved steadily from one vacant unit to the next, installing cabinets, laying flooring, and completing the final inspections that would soon allow families to move back into finished apartments. The pace increased without becoming chaotic. Levi insisted that every phase remain organized. He wanted the project to feel purposeful, not disruptive. That approach required constant communication. Each afternoon, updated notices appeared on the bulletin board near the mailboxes. Water interruptions, parking adjustments, delivery schedules. Every change was explained clearly and posted well in advance. Naomi continued helping distribute information to the remaining residents who still visited regularly to collect mail or check on neighbors. Only now she wasn't doing it alone. One morning Levi arrived carrying several folders. I made copies. Naomi looked up from the table in the laundry room, where she was organizing temporary forwarding addresses. You didn't have to. I know, she smiled. You've started saying that before I do. I'm learning. She laughed. Apparently, together they arranged envelopes into neat stacks. Each contained information explaining the renovation timeline, expected completion dates, and the process former residents could use if they wished to return once apartments became available. Naomi paused while reading one of the letters. You included everyone's original apartment number. Levi nodded. I thought it might help. She looked at him with quiet appreciation. It tells them they're remembered. I hoped it would. She gently placed the letter back on the table. That's going to mean more than you realize. By early afternoon, several former residents stopped by after receiving Levi's phone calls. Some wanted to ask questions. Others simply wanted to see the progress with their own eyes. Levi personally walked each family through the finished apartments. He explained the improvements without rushing them. He listened more than he spoke. One older couple stood inside a newly completed unit for several minutes without saying anything. Finally, the husband smiled. It still feels familiar. Levi nodded. I wanted it to. You kept the courtyard. We did. My wife was hoping you wouldn't replace the benches. Levi smiled. They've been restored. The woman looked through the window toward the courtyard below. We spent so many evenings sitting there with our neighbors. You'll be welcome to again. Tears filled her eyes. Thank you. After they left, Levi found Naomi standing quietly outside the leasing office. You were watching. I was. What did you think? She looked toward the parking lot, where the couple slowly walked hand in hand. I think they already started coming home before they signed anything. Levi followed her gaze. So do I. Construction continued throughout the week. There were still unexpected delays. One shipment of flooring arrived late. A plumbing inspection had to be repeated after a minor correction. No one treated those setbacks like disasters. The project simply adjusted and continued. Late Friday afternoon, Levi noticed Naomi carrying several heavy storage boxes from a small utility room. Without a word, he crossed the hallway. I'll take those. They aren't that heavy. He lifted the top box anyway. They're heavy enough. She started to protest before stopping herself. Instead, she smiled. I'm getting used to accepting help. I noticed. It still feels strange. Why? She considered the question while they walked. I've spent so many years believing I needed to solve every problem myself. You never actually did. I know, she glanced at him. But people let me believe I was helping. You were helping. I couldn't do everything. No one can, she nodded slowly. I think I'm finally learning that. When they reached apartment 18, her father opened the door before either of them knocked. You two look like you've been arguing. Naomi laughed. We weren't. He insisted on carrying boxes. Her father looked at Levi. Good. I didn't exactly give her a choice. The older man smiled knowingly. Sometimes accepting kindness is another way of giving it. Naomi folded her arms with a playful smile. You two have started sounding alike. Levi chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. So will I, her father replied. That evening, after construction crews had gone home, Levi and Naomi walked through the quiet courtyard together. The repaired benches had been returned to their original places. Fresh lights now illuminated the pathways without changing the familiar atmosphere residents remembered. The building looked renewed. It still felt like itself. Naomi stopped beside one of the flower beds that workers had recently prepared for spring planting. I've been thinking. Levi looked at her. About what? The day you first arrived. I remember it. I thought you'd see this place the way everyone else did. And how was that? An old building. He smiled. I did, she nodded. But you don't anymore. No. What do you see now? Levi looked across the courtyard. The restored benches, the freshly painted entrance, the windows reflecting the evening sky. Then he answered honestly. I see the people who filled this place with memories long before I ever owned it. Naomi smiled. I was hoping you'd say something like that. They continued walking at the same unhurried pace they had naturally settled into over the past several weeks. Neither conversation nor silence felt forced. Neither of them tried to impress the other. Their friendship had grown through ordinary days, shared responsibilities, and quiet respect. It had never required dramatic moments. As they reached the entrance, Naomi looked toward the apartments above them. It finally feels like people can look forward instead of looking back. Levi nodded. That's the goal. She smiled warmly. I think we're getting there. Levi looked once more at the building. The renovation was no longer simply about restoring walls, plumbing, or electrical systems. Little by little, it had become about restoring confidence that this community still had a future. And for the first time since purchasing the property, Levi realized he wasn't carrying that responsibility alone. By the middle of March, winter had begun to loosen its grip on Ogden. The piles of snow that had lined the edges of the parking lot for weeks had nearly disappeared. Small patches of green pushed through the thawing ground around the courtyard, and the morning air carried the unmistakable promise of spring. The apartment building reflected the season. What had once echoed with demolition and repairs now sounded different. Painters applied final coats of trim. Electricians completed their last inspections. Cabinets were wiped clean. Windows shone in the afternoon sunlight. The renovation that had once seemed endless was quietly reaching its conclusion. Levi walked through the first completed hallway with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, though he rarely looked at it anymore. Instead, he noticed the details people would actually remember. The hallway lights no longer flickered. The repaired handrail still felt familiar beneath his hand. The restored benches waited in the courtyard exactly where longtime residents expected to find them. Nothing felt extravagant. Everything felt cared for. One by one, the final occupancy permits arrived. By the end of the week, the first returning residents began moving back. Levi stood outside early Friday morning as a moving truck pulled into the parking lot. The older couple, who had toured the renovated apartment weeks earlier, stepped out first. The husband smiled as he looked toward the building. It still looks like home. His wife squeezed his hand. It really does. Levi walked over to greet them. Welcome back. The husband looked around the courtyard before answering. It's good to be here again. As movers carried furniture inside, Another familiar car entered the parking lot. Then another. Throughout the day, former residents arrived carrying boxes, lamps, framed photographs, and the ordinary belongings that slowly turn apartments into homes. Some paused to greet one another before unpacking. Others stood in the courtyard talking as though they had only been apart for a weekend instead of several months. Children who had once played together recognized familiar faces almost immediately. Within minutes, laughter drifted across the courtyard. Levi watched quietly from the entrance. He had expected people to appreciate the renovated apartments. He hadn't expected how quickly they would begin rebuilding the life between them. Late that afternoon, Naomi finished her shift at the clinic and pulled into the parking lot. She stopped before getting out of her car. Several families were already sitting on the restored benches while children chased one another across the courtyard. An elderly resident waved enthusiastically the moment she saw Naomi. "There you are!" Naomi smiled and walked over. "You made it back." "We did." The older woman reached for Naomi's hands. "I've missed this place." Naomi looked around the courtyard. "So have I." Another returning resident called her name from across the sidewalk. Before long, several conversations surrounded her at once. People asked about her father, thanked her for checking on them during the relocation, shared stories about temporary apartments that never quite felt like home. Naomi listened to every person with the same patient attention she always had. Levi noticed something. She greeted everyone exactly as she had before they moved away. Nothing about her had changed. The only difference was that she no longer carried the responsibility alone. Several neighbors were already helping one another unload furniture before anyone asked. One resident carried groceries for another. Someone else assembled a bookshelf, while two children searched for missing screws. Acts of kindness had begun multiplying naturally. Levi smiled to himself. Communities remembered how to care for one another. As evening approached, Naomi found him standing beside the newly planted flower beds. "You've been watching all afternoon." "I have." She looked toward the courtyard. "I don't think I've seen this many smiles here in months." "Neither have I." They stood together in comfortable silence. Finally, Naomi spoke. "Do you remember the day you asked why I stayed?" "I do." "I told you home wasn't these walls." "You did." She nodded toward the returning families. "I think today explains what I meant better than I ever could." Levi followed her gaze. Children raced bicycles along the sidewalks. Neighbors held apartment doors open while furniture was carried inside. Someone started a pot of coffee and invited anyone who needed a break to stop by. Nothing had been organized. Nothing had been announced. People simply began looking after one another again. "It does," Levi said quietly. Naomi smiled. "You helped make this possible." He shook his head. "I helped repair a building." She looked at him. "You did more than that." Before he could answer, her father walked slowly across the courtyard carrying a small watering can. He stopped beside one of the freshly planted flower beds. "I figured these might appreciate a drink." Naomi laughed. "They were planted this morning. They're still adjusting." Levi stepped forward. "I can take that." Her father handed him the watering can without hesitation. "Good." Together, the three of them watered the young plants, while neighbors continued settling into their apartments. It was an ordinary task, yet Levi couldn't remember another moment in his career that felt more satisfying. The project reports would eventually show occupancy rates. Financial statements would measure rental income. Construction records would document completed improvements. None of those reports would capture what he was witnessing. No spreadsheet could measure the relief on a family's face after returning home. No balance sheet could record children laughing together in the courtyard. No investment summary could explain the quiet comfort of neighbors recognizing one another after months apart. Standing in the fading light of early evening, Levi realized the most meaningful results of the renovation had never appeared in the budget. They appeared in the people. And every conversation taking place around him quietly confirmed that the strongest parts of this building had never been made of brick, wood, or concrete. The official reopening was scheduled for the following Saturday. Levi had suggested keeping the event simple. A few tables in the courtyard, coffee, pastries from the neighborhood bakery that Naomi had introduced him to weeks earlier. A chance for former and returning residents to spend an afternoon together. Nothing elaborate. The community had never needed elaborate things to bring people together. By mid-morning, the courtyard was filled with familiar faces. Fresh spring sunshine reflected from the newly cleaned windows, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming trees from the nearby streets. Children raced between the benches with the easy confidence that only came from feeling safe. Older residents settled into conversations that resumed as though they had never been interrupted. Construction crews who had spent months restoring the building stopped by after receiving invitations from Levi. Several accepted with genuine curiosity. They wanted to see the place after people had returned. "It feels different," one electrician quietly admitted. His coworker nodded. "It finally feels complete." Levi understood exactly what he meant. A beautifully restored building still felt unfinished until people filled it with ordinary life. Near one of the tables, Naomi moved naturally from conversation to conversation. She greeted families returning to their apartments. She introduced neighbors who had never formally met, despite living in the same building years earlier. She laughed with children, who proudly showed her drawings they had made during the relocation. She checked that everyone had something to eat before taking a plate for herself. Levi noticed she almost walked away before serving herself. Without saying anything, he placed another plate into her hands. "You first." She smiled knowingly. "I'm getting better at this, I've noticed." Her father approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought the 2 of you might need these." Levi accepted one. "Thank you." The older man looked around the courtyard with quiet satisfaction. "I haven't seen this place this lively in years." Naomi nodded. "It sounds like itself again." Around noon, Levi tapped a spoon gently against his coffee cup. The conversations gradually softened as residents turned toward him. He looked around the courtyard before speaking. "I wasn't planning to make a long speech." Several people smiled. "I'm grateful all of you came today." He paused for a moment. "When I first purchased this building, I believed I understood its value." He glanced toward the restored apartments surrounding the courtyard. "I thought its value was measured by square footage, renovation costs, occupancy rates, and long-term investment." A few people nodded politely. "I wasn't wrong." He smiled. "I just wasn't complete." The courtyard grew very still. "I've renovated buildings for many years." He looked toward the families gathered together. "This project taught me something none of the others ever had." He slowly turned until he was facing Naomi. "The strongest part of this building was never the concrete foundation beneath it." Naomi looked surprised. Levi continued. "It was built by people who chose to care for one another every single day." Several residents glanced toward Naomi before looking back at Levi. "I discovered that lesson because of one person." Naomi immediately shook her head. "You don't have to." He smiled gently. "I do." She grew quiet. Levi looked back toward everyone gathered there. "When I arrived, I kept finding the same words written in old maintenance records." A few neighbors exchanged curious looks. "Ask Naomi." Soft laughter spread through the courtyard. Levi continued. "No matter what the problem was, packages, spare keys, checking on neighbors, helping during emergencies, making sure no one felt forgotten, the answer always seemed to be the same." Several residents nodded knowingly. "I've spent the past few months watching something remarkable." He looked at Naomi again. "I've watched someone help people without asking for recognition." Naomi lowered her eyes, visibly uncomfortable being the center of attention. "I've watched her quietly carry groceries." Heads nodded around the courtyard. "Visit neighbors after work." More smiles appeared. "Help children with homework." A parent quietly whispered, "She did." "Deliver meals." An older resident answered softly, "Many times." Stay beside people during difficult seasons. The courtyard remained completely silent. Levi smiled warmly. The interesting thing is that most of us only remember one or two of those moments. He looked around the gathering. But together, you've all witnessed hundreds of them. Naomi blinked several times before looking away. Her father rested one reassuring hand on her shoulder. Levi took a slow breath. Buildings can be renovated in a matter of months. He paused. The kind of trust Naomi built here took years. No one applauded immediately. The silence itself carried more meaning than applause could have. Then the elderly woman who had first returned to the building stepped forward. She hugged Naomi tightly. "You were there after my surgery." Another resident smiled. "You drove my grandson to school when my car wouldn't start." The young father who had once spoken to Levi raised his hand. "You checked on my wife every afternoon after our daughter was born." One after another, people began sharing memories. Short ones, simple ones, honest ones. "You sat with me after my husband passed. You helped me fill out paperwork I couldn't understand. You never forgot my birthday. You brought soup when I was sick. You fixed my smoke detector before anyone else even knew it was broken." Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. "I didn't think anyone remembered." Her father smiled gently. "Kindness is rarely forgotten." Tears filled Naomi's eyes as she looked around the courtyard. For years she had quietly believed those ordinary moments had simply been part of being a good neighbor. She had never realized how deeply they had shaped the lives surrounding her. Levi watched without saying another word. This moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the community Naomi had spent years building. One ordinary act of kindness at a time. As conversations slowly resumed, the courtyard somehow felt even warmer than before. The renovations had restored every apartment. But the gratitude filling the space that afternoon revealed something far more enduring. The building had not simply reopened. It had come home. The celebration continued well into the afternoon. No one seemed eager to leave. Children played games in the courtyard until they grew tired enough to collapse onto the restored benches beside their parents. Neighbors wandered in and out of one another's apartments, admiring fresh paint, updated kitchens, and familiar photographs finding their way back onto newly painted walls. The building felt settled again, not because every renovation had been completed, because people had returned. Levi stood near the entrance for a while, quietly observing the conversations unfolding around him. A construction foreman stopped beside him. "I've worked on apartment renovations for almost 20 years. Levi looked over. "So have I." The foreman nodded toward the courtyard. "I've never stayed after a project was finished." "What made today different?" The man smiled. "I wanted to see whether everything we repaired actually mattered." Levi followed his gaze toward the families gathered together. "What do you think now?" The foreman chuckled softly. "I think we repaired more than walls." Levi smiled. "I think you're right." A few minutes later, the foreman shook Levi's hand before leaving. As he walked away, Levi found himself thinking back to the day he first unlocked the front doors after purchasing the property. He remembered seeing empty apartments, deferred maintenance, leaking pipes, broken fixtures, a long list of repairs waiting to be completed. At the time, he believed those were the building's greatest problems. Now he understood how incomplete that view had been. The building had never needed someone willing to rescue it. It had needed someone willing to recognize what was already worth protecting. Across the courtyard, Naomi was helping several children arrange flower pots along the walkway. She wasn't directing them. She was simply kneeling beside them, showing them how to leave enough space between each pot so the flowers would have room to grow. One little boy looked up at her. "Will they bloom soon?" Naomi smiled. "They'll take a little time." "How long?" She looked toward the fresh soil. "Long enough to grow strong." The boy nodded with complete confidence. "Then we'll wait." Levi couldn't help smiling. It reminded him of everything the past few months had taught him. Some things could not be hurried. Not trust, not friendships, not communities. Those were built patiently, one ordinary day after another. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, many residents gathered for one final group photograph in the courtyard. Someone handed Levi a camera. "You should be in this one too," a resident called out. Levi looked around. "Then somebody else will have to take the picture." Naomi stepped forward. "I can." He handed her the camera. She carefully framed everyone together. "Ready?" People gathered a little closer. Children squeezed between grandparents. Neighbors rested hands on familiar shoulders. Everyone smiled. Just before Naomi pressed the shutter, Levi spoke. "Wait." She lowered the camera slightly. "What?" "You should be in the picture." She immediately shook her head. "I've taken plenty of photos over the years." "Exactly," Levi replied. "You're always behind the camera." Several neighbors agreed. "Come on, Naomi. You belong in this one." One of the teenagers who had returned with her family stepped forward. "I'll take it." Naomi hesitated for a moment. Then she handed over the camera. She walked slowly toward the group. Without thinking about it, she naturally stopped beside her father. Levi moved one step to make room. When she looked up, their eyes met briefly. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The photographer smiled. "Everyone ready?" The courtyard answered with cheerful agreement. The camera clicked. One simple photograph captured months of work, years of friendship, and countless ordinary moments that had quietly connected every person standing there. Later, after the celebration had ended and the last folding tables had been put away, the courtyard grew peaceful again. The lights along the pathways glowed softly as evening settled over the neighborhood. Levi remained outside for a few minutes before heading home. He heard footsteps behind him. Naomi joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might still be here." "I usually am." She handed him one of the cups. They sat together on the restored bench overlooking the courtyard. For a while, they simply listened. A family laughed from an upstairs balcony. Someone closed an apartment door. A child called goodnight to a friend across the courtyard. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of people who felt they belonged. Naomi wrapped both hands around her cup. "When all of this started, I wasn't sure what would happen." "I wasn't either. I worried we'd lose something that couldn't be replaced." Levi nodded. "So did I." She smiled. "I was wrong." He looked at her. "No." She shook her head gently. "I thought one person had to protect this place." Her eyes moved across the courtyard. "I finally understand that communities don't survive because of one neighbor." She smiled warmly. "They survive because kindness spreads." Levi considered her words carefully. "It really does." She turned toward him. "And you believed it was worth protecting." "I'm glad I did." "So am I." Neither rushed to fill the comfortable silence that followed. The friendship they had built over the past several months had never depended on dramatic declarations. It had grown through shared responsibility, quiet conversations, mutual respect, and the simple decision to keep showing up. Levi looked across the courtyard one last time. The renovated apartments stood proudly beneath the evening sky. Fresh paint would eventually fade. Landscaping would need attention. Fixtures would wear with time. One day, another owner would almost certainly purchase the property. Buildings always required maintenance. That was part of their nature. Communities were different. They endured only when ordinary people chose, day after day, to care for one another without expecting recognition. Levi smiled as neighbors continued wishing each other good night. When he first arrived, he believed he had purchased an apartment building. He now knew he had become part of something far more valuable. Beside him, Naomi quietly watched the lights shining from apartment windows that were no longer empty. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Everything that mattered was already visible around them. The strongest foundations had never been hidden beneath the concrete. They had always been found in compassion trust, and the ordinary acts of kindness that people chose to repeat, day after day, until strangers slowly became neighbors. Neighbors became friends, and a collection of apartments became a place that truly felt like home.